There, all finalized. This will secure the deal.
Richard Hensley had built his company from nothing, or at least that was the story he told at every dinner party, every golf outing, every interview with local business magazines. The truth was messier. 22 years earlier, when he was a mid-level manager, with more ambition than capital, it was Diane who had believed in him first. She had been sharp, funny, the kind of woman who could read a balance sheet as easily as she read a novel. Her father, Walter Whitfield, had built a modest manufacturing supply company over 4 decades, and when Richard needed a break, it was Diane who quietly arranged the first contract between her father's company and Richard's fledgling operation.
It's a deal. Excellent. We're looking forward to it. Welcome to Whitfield. Thank you.
For years, the marriage worked the way most successful marriages do. Through partnership nobody outside the house ever saw. Diane handled the parts of the business Richard found tedious. The contracts, the long-term supplier relationships, the quiet negotiations that kept everything running smoothly behind the scenes. Richard handled the parts that got him applause, the pitches, the ribbon cuttings, the magazine covers. Their son Caleb grew up watching his father shake hands in front of cameras, and his mother work at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. It was an arrangement built on an old imbalance, one where credit flowed in one direction and effort flowed in the other. Nobody questioned it out loud, least of all Diane, who genuinely loved her husband and believed the sacrifice was temporary. The accident happened on a rainy October evening, 7 years before the divorce. On a stretch of highway Diane had driven 1,000 times without incident. A truck driver, exhausted after a double shift, drifted into her lane just after 9 at night. Diane survived, but the impact fractured her spine in 2 places. The months that followed were filled with surgeries, therapies, and a new reality that neither of them had prepared for. She would never walk unassisted again. Richard visited her in the hospital every day for the first few weeks, holding her hand, telling her everything would be fine, that they would get through it together. For a while he even seemed to mean it. But slowly, in ways so small that Diane herself struggled to name them, something in Richard's affection curdled into resentment. It started with impatience, a sigh when her wheelchair took an extra minute to load into the car, a flash of irritation when a restaurant wasn't accessible and they had to find another. It grew into embarrassment, a reluctance to bring her to certain events, a habit of describing her to new business contacts as dealing with some health issues instead of simply saying his wife used a wheelchair. Diane noticed all of it. She said nothing, hoping it was a phase, hoping the man who once credited her with saving his career would remember who she was underneath the chair. He didn't remember. If anything, the further his business grew, the more Richard seemed to view Diane as an obstacle, standing between himself and the image he wanted to project. He had started attending charity galas alone, telling people she preferred to rest. He had begun taking business trips that conveniently avoided any mention of bringing his wife. And in the private moments at home, the tenderness that once defined their marriage was replaced by a clipped, transactional tone, the kind reserved for employees rather than spouses. Diane began keeping a journal during this period, not out of suspicion, but out of a need to hold on to her own sense of reality, as the version of her husband she had trusted slowly disappeared. The final unraveling began at a fundraising dinner for a local children's hospital, an event Richard had been asked to speak at as a prominent local business figure. Diane, against his quiet objections, insisted on attending. She wanted to see her husband honored. She wanted, one more time, to feel like part of the life they had built together. What she witnessed instead was Richard, 3 drinks into the evening, laughing with a group of colleagues near the bar. When one of them gestured toward Diane's wheelchair and asked, not unkindly, how she was adjusting, Richard let out a short laugh and said the words that would end the marriage before either of them formally admitted it. Honestly, some days it feels like I married a burden instead of a wife. The room didn't go silent, not the way it might in a movie. Conversations continued around them. Glasses clinked. A jazz quartet kept playing in the corner. But Diane heard every syllable with a clarity that felt almost violent. She did not cry. She did not make a scene. She simply wheeled herself toward the exit. past caterers and unaware guests, out into the cool night air, where she sat alone for nearly 20 minutes before calling a car service to take her home. Richard did not notice she was gone until nearly an hour later, and even then, his first thought was irritation at having to explain her absence to colleagues. When Richard finally arrived home that night, well past midnight, he found Diane sitting in the living room, calm in a way that unsettled him more than anger would have. She did not yell, she did not demand an apology. She simply told him she had heard what he said, word for word, and that something in her had quietly closed that night, a door she suspected would never reopen. Richard, half expecting a fight, was almost disappointed by how little resistance she offered. In his mind, her calmness confirmed what he had already begun to believe, that she had accepted her diminished place in his life, that she understood, on some level, that she had become less than she once was. Within a month, Richard had contacted a divorce attorney, a sharp, expensive man named Gordon Pierce, who specialized in what he called clean separations for high-net-worth clients. Richard's instructions were simple. He wanted the process fast, and he wanted to keep the business entirely under his name. He assumed Diane's assets amounted to little more than the house, some furniture, and a modest disability payment. He had never bothered to review the details of her father's estate after Walter Whitfield passed away 6 years earlier, dismissing it at the time as her side of the family's business. It was a decision that would haunt him more than any other he made that year. Gordon Pierce, ever thorough, had suggested more than once that Richard commission a full financial disclosure before finalizing the settlement, standard practice in a divorce involving a business of this size. Richard waved him off each time, telling him not to waste billable hours digging through what he assumed was nothing. "She's not exactly running a company from her wheelchair," he said once, laughing at his own comment in a way that made even Gordon, a man not easily unsettled, pause for a moment before continuing. Diane, for her part, signed every document her own attorney recommended without complaint, offering no resistance to the terms Richard proposed, a fact that later struck several people as strange, though at the time it seemed simply like grief. The divorce was finalized on a gray Tuesday morning, in the very office where Richard had once signed his first contract with Diane's father decades earlier, a detail neither of them acknowledged aloud. Though Diane noticed it the moment she wheeled into the building, Richard signed quickly, already mentally moving toward the rest of his day. A lunch meeting, a call with an investor, dinner plans with a woman named Vanessa Croft he had been seeing for the past 2 months. Diane signed more slowly, her pen moving with quiet deliberation, and before she left the room, she said only one sentence to Richard, delivered without malice or triumph. "I hope you never need to ask me for anything." Richard barely registered the comment at the time, chalking it up to wounded pride, the kind of thing people say when they want the last word in a conversation they lost. He left the building feeling lighter than he had in months, already imagining the next chapter of his life, one where Vanessa, 12 years his junior and endlessly complimentary of his business instincts, would stand beside him at every gala and every photo opportunity without hesitation. He had no idea that within 90 days, the very foundation of the company he was so eager to protect would begin to crack, and that the woman he had just discarded held the only key capable of repairing it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly, the way most real disasters do, buried inside a routine email from Hensley Industries' primary materials supplier. For 18 years, the company had sourced nearly 60% of its specialized components from Whitfield Manufacturing Supply, the business Diane's father had built, and which, after his passing, had been folded into a private holding structure, managed by a small family trust. Richard had always assumed this relationship was simply a vendor contract, renewed automatically, one of dozens of operational details he never bothered to examine personally. He had never asked who actually controlled the trust that owned Whitfield Manufacturing Supply, and nobody in his company had thought to check, because for 18 years it had never mattered. The email, sent by a mid-level account manager, informed Hensley Industries that their current supply agreement was set to expire in 90 days and would not be automatically renewed under its previous terms. pending a routine review by the trust's newly appointed sole trustee. Richard's operations director forwarded the email to him with a note asking whether he wanted legal to handle the renewal as usual. Richard, distracted by a product launch and increasingly absorbed in his relationship with Vanessa, told him to simply resubmit the standard paperwork and stop bothering him with routine vendor matters. He did not ask who the newly appointed trustee was. He would learn that answer soon enough, in the worst possible way. 2 weeks later, a second problem surfaced. This one, impossible to ignore. Hensley Industries had spent the better part of 3 years developing a proprietary component coating process, one that gave their products a durability edge over every competitor in their market segment. The patent application for this process, filed jointly nearly 4 years earlier during a period when Richard and Diane still filed most business matters together for tax purposes, had been quietly finalized under both their names as co-inventors. A formality Richard's lawyer at the time insisted upon given Diane's early technical contributions to the concept. Richard had forgotten this detail entirely. He was reminded of it when his patent attorney called, sounding unusually tense, to ask whether Richard was aware that Diane Hensley had recently filed to formally separate her ownership interest in the patent following the finalization of the divorce. Richard's confusion turned to concern, then to something closer to panic, when his attorney explained the implications in plain terms. Because the patent had been filed under joint ownership, and because the divorce settlement, rushed and poorly reviewed at Richard's own insistence, had failed to specifically address intellectual property rights separately from marital property, Diane retained full and independent rights to license, restrict, or withdraw her portion of the patented process. In practical terms, this meant she could legally prevent Hensley Industries from continuing to use the very manufacturing process that made their flagship product superior to anything else on the market, a process competitors had been trying and failing to replicate for years. Richard sat in his office for a long time after that call, staring at a settlement agreement he had once been so eager to sign without reading closely. Richard's first instinct was denial, followed quickly by anger. The kind of anger that comes from a man realizing his own arrogance may have cost him more than he ever imagined. He called Gordon Pierce, demanding to know how something like this had slipped through the settlement process. Gordon, with the practiced patience of a man who had warned his client repeatedly, reminded Richard of the multiple conversations where he had suggested a full financial and intellectual property disclosure before finalizing terms. Conversations Richard had dismissed each time with some version of the same phrase, "She's not going to fight me on this." Gordon's tone remained professional, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. The tone of a man watching a predictable outcome unfold exactly as predicted. Meanwhile, the supplier situation grew worse. Richard's operations director, digging deeper after the vendor's unusual response, discovered that the trust-controlling Whitfield Manufacturing Supply had indeed appointed a new sole trustee 3 months earlier, shortly before the divorce proceedings began. The name attached to the trustee filing was Diane Whitfield Hensley. Richard's father-in-law, it turned out, had structured his estate with unusual foresight, placing controlling interest of the supply company not directly in Diane's name during the marriage, where it might have been considered joint marital property subject to division, but inside a separate family trust designed to activate full trustee control only upon a specific triggering event, one that Walter Whitfield had apparently anticipated long before anyone else did: the dissolution of his daughter's marriage. Richard, desperate now, requested an emergency meeting with his board of directors to explain the unfolding crisis before it became public knowledge. The meeting did not go well. Several board members, already uneasy about Richard's increasingly public relationship with Vanessa Croft and the perception it created among longtime clients, pressed him on how a divorce settlement had been allowed to jeopardize both the company's primary supply chain and its most valuable patented process simultaneously. Richard offered vague reassurances, promising the situation would be resolved quietly and quickly. Privately, he understood that resolving it meant doing something he had never imagined he would need to do. Personally, humbly, approaching the woman he had once called a burden in front of a room full of strangers. In the weeks that followed, Richard tried every alternative he could think of before considering that conversation. He instructed his legal team to explore whether the patent's co-inventor status could be challenged or diluted through litigation, a process his attorneys estimated could take upward of 2 years and carry no guarantee of success, time the company could not afford to lose given the looming supplier deadline. He explored alternative manufacturing partners for the specialized components, only to learn that Whitfield Manufacturing Supply held certain proprietary machinery configurations that no other regional supplier could replicate within the necessary timeline. Every path he investigated led back to the same uncomfortable truth. Diane held leverage over both critical points of failure, and no amount of legal maneuvering could manufacture a shortcut around her. Vanessa, when she learned the extent of the crisis, reacted in a way that revealed more about her own priorities than Richard initially wanted to admit. She grew distant during a period when Richard needed support the most, her enthusiasm for public appearances quietly cooling as rumors of financial instability at Hensley Industries began circulating among their social circle. She never explicitly said she was reconsidering the relationship, but Richard noticed the change, the slower responses to his messages, the sudden scheduling conflicts when he suggested events together. It was a quiet, uncomfortable preview of what Richard had once done to Diane, watching someone recalculate his worth the moment his circumstances shifted. Though Richard, still absorbed in his own crisis, did not yet see the parallel clearly. 41 days before the supplier deadline, with no viable alternative remaining, Richard finally made the call he had been avoiding. He asked to meet Diane in person. Diane agreed to the meeting without hesitation, choosing a quiet coffee shop near her home rather than any location connected to Hensley Industries, a small but deliberate choice that put the conversation entirely on her terms. Richard arrived early, rehearsing what he might say, the same instinct for confident persuasion that had served him in countless negotiations over the years. He assumed this conversation would be no different. He was wrong in ways he could not yet anticipate. Diane arrived exactly on time, composed in a way that immediately unsettled him more than anger would have. Richard began cautiously, acknowledging that the past few months had been difficult for the company, careful not to reveal the full extent of the crisis, still operating under the assumption that he could negotiate his way to a favorable outcome through charm alone. Diane listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, until Richard finally arrived at the actual request, asking whether she would consider renewing the supply agreement and formally licensing her portion of the patent back to the company under standard commercial terms. When he finished, there was a long pause before Diane responded, and when she did, her voice carried none of the bitterness Richard had braced for, only a quiet, devastating clarity. She reminded him calmly that she had spent 18 years contributing to the very foundation of the business he now stood to lose. Work that went entirely uncredited in every interview, every magazine profile, every speech he had given crediting only his own vision and hard work. She reminded him of the night at the fundraising gala, the words he had said so casually, so publicly, in front of colleagues he valued more than the wife sitting a few feet away in a wheelchair. She told him she had not orchestrated any of this out of vengeance, that her father's trust structure had been established years before their marriage even began showing strain, a simple act of prudent estate planning that had nothing to do with punishing Richard and everything to do with protecting his daughter's future. The timing, she said, was simply the truth revealing itself. Richard, humbled in a way he had never experienced in his adult life, asked directly what it would take for her to help him, expecting some negotiation, some price he could pay to make the problem disappear, the way he had made every other problem in his career disappear. Diane's answer was simpler than he expected, and somehow more painful. She told him she had no interest in destroying the company, since hundreds of employees who had nothing to do with his personal failures depended on it for their livelihoods. But she also told him, with a steadiness that left no room for negotiation, that she would not personally renew anything, would not sign anything, would not lift a single finger to save the business built on the same ground where he had once called her a burden. Instead, she explained, she had already transferred her trustee authority over Whitfield Manufacturing Supply's licensing decisions to an independent board of directors 2 weeks earlier. along with her portion of the patent rights. Structured as a fully separate licensing entity, with its own commercial terms available to any manufacturer willing to meet them, Hensley Industries included, on exactly the same terms as any competitor. She had removed herself entirely from the decision, refusing to be either Richard's savior or his obstacle, choosing instead to simply step outside the story altogether and let the business world evaluate Hensley Industries on its own merit, without her name, her history, or her forgiveness attached to the outcome in any way. Richard sat in stunned silence, realizing there would be no dramatic confrontation, no ultimatum to negotiate, no leverage point he could push against. Diane had removed herself so completely from the equation that his careful rehearsed apology, the one he had been prepared to deliver if charm alone failed, had nowhere to land. She was not punishing him, she was simply done, in a way that offered him nothing to fight against and no path back to the comfortable arrogance that had defined his approach to every relationship in his life, personal or professional. Diane gathered her things, thanked the barista by name on her way out, a small human detail that struck Richard harder than any accusation could have, and left him sitting alone at the table with a coffee that had long gone cold. In the months that followed, Hensley Industries did survive, though not in the form Richard once imagined. The company was forced to renegotiate its manufacturing terms as an ordinary client rather than a favored partner, absorbing costs that ate significantly into its margins and required Richard to lay off nearly a fifth of his workforce to remain solvent. The patent, now independently licensed, became available to two of his competitors as well, erasing the advantage that had once made his product uniquely superior. Richard kept his company, technically, but the version that survived was smaller, humbler, and stripped of the exceptional edge he had once taken entirely for granted, a fitting reflection of a man who had also mistaken support for weakness and confused partnership for burden. Vanessa Croft ended their relationship quietly 3 months after the coffee shop meeting, citing, in a carefully worded message, a need to focus on her own career during an uncertain time, a phrase Richard recognized immediately as the same detached calculation he himself had once applied to Diane. Caleb, their son, now in his final year of college, grew increasingly distant from his father, as details of the divorce and its aftermath became impossible to hide within their small social circle, choosing instead to spend holidays with his mother, who, freed from decades of quiet self-erasure, had begun pursuing a graduate degree in structural engineering, the field she had abandoned decades earlier to support her husband's ambitions. Diane rebuilt her life gradually, not out of triumph or revenge, but out of a simple, patient reclamation of the person she had been before she folded herself into someone else's story. She moved into a smaller, fully accessible home she designed herself, incorporating details she had once been told were unnecessary luxuries. She returned to old friendships she had let fade during years of managing Richard's public image, and she began mentoring young engineering students through a scholarship fund established quietly in her father's name, a fund that specifically supported women returning to technical fields after long personal interruptions. She rarely spoke of Richard publicly, and when she did, it was without bitterness, simply as a chapter that had ended the moment he decided her worth was measured by her usefulness. Richard, meanwhile, spent the following year rebuilding not just his company, but his understanding of what he had actually lost. In quiet moments, he found himself replaying the fundraising gala, the careless laugh, the 6 words that had unraveled everything he built, wondering how differently things might have gone had he simply valued the partnership that made his success possible in the first place, instead of the image it allowed him to project. He never fully recovered the market position he once held, and more painfully, he never fully understood, until it was far too late, that the one thing he truly needed all along had never been the patent, the supply contract, or the business at all. It had been the quiet, unwavering support of a woman he decided, one careless evening, was simply too much trouble to keep. Was Richard's downfall truly about a patent and a supply contract, or was it about a man who never understood the value of what he already had until the moment it was gone? Would you have recognized the warning signs sooner than he did? Let us know in the comments what you think Richard should have done differently, and if you enjoyed this story, Stay close, because our next story might hit even closer to home. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what happens next.